The train shudders beneath me, a groaning beast of steel and shadows hurtling through the pre-dawn blackness. My breath plumes in the frigid air of the carriage, each exhalation a ghostly reminder of the unnatural quiet. It's 4:17 a.m., according to the flickering digital display above the door, and I'm the only one awake. Or at least, I think I am. The other passengers are slumped in their seats, limbs at awkward angles, faces obscured by the low light filtering in from the desolate platforms we occasionally pass. They look too still, and that's the first tendril of unease, the icy finger tracing a line down my spine. They aren't just sleeping, they're like mannequins, posed but lifeless. Pause, and then there's the writing, scrawled in what can only be dried blood across the grimy window next to me. Do not look at the moon. I hadn't even noticed it until the train lurched, throwing my gaze outward. There is no moon tonight, just a suffocating blanket of cloud. So why the warning? Why the blood? I need to tell you what happened, how I ended up on this train, following rules written by a madman, or something far worse. The train shudders beneath me, a groaning beast of steel and shadows hurtling through the pre-dawn blackness. My breath plumes in the frigid air of the carriage, each exhalation a ghostly reminder of the unnatural quiet. It's 4:17 a.m., according to the flickering digital display above the door, and I'm the only one awake. Or, at least, I think I am. The other passengers are slumped in their seats, limbs at awkward angles, faces obscured by the low light filtering in from the desolate platforms we occasionally pass. They look too still, and that's the first tendril of unease, the icy finger tracing a line down my spine. They aren't just sleeping, they're like mannequins, posed but lifeless. Pause, and then there's the writing, scrawled in what can only be dried blood across the grimy window next to me. Do not look at the moon. I hadn't even noticed it until the train lurched, throwing my gaze outward. There is no moon tonight, just a suffocating blanket of cloud. So why the warning? Why the blood? I need to tell you what happened, how I ended up on this train, following rules written by a madman, or something far worse. It started with a job, a simple enough sounding gig that promised good money for very little actual work. Desperate times, as they say. My landlord was breathing down my neck. My savings had evaporated like morning mist, and the rejection letters from every halfway decent job application were piling up on my kitchen counter like morbid confetti. So when I saw the ad, night courier, confidential deliveries, generous compensation, I didn't ask too many questions. A late-night meeting in a dimly lit cafe with a man whose face was mostly hidden by the brim of his hat, and the perpetual shadow he seemed to carry around him, and I had the job. The details were vague. I was to board the 4 a.m. overnight train from Platform 7 at the Central Station. A package would be waiting for me in a specific compartment. My task was simply to ensure it arrived at its destination, a small, unmarked station 3 stops away, and hand it over to whoever was waiting there. No peeking inside the package, no deviations, no contact with other passengers. He emphasized that last part with a chilling intensity that even the lukewarm coffee couldn't dispel. Understood, he'd rasped, his voice like sandpaper on bone. I'd nodded, perhaps a little too eagerly, blinded by the promise of a much-needed paycheck. He'd slid a thick envelope across the table, half the payment up front, the other half upon completion. It felt like dirty money even then, tainted by the secrecy and the man's unsettling demeanor. But I took it. I needed it. The station, at that hour, was a cavern of echoing footsteps and hushed announcements. Platform 7 was almost deserted. Just a few solitary figures huddled on benches, their faces turned away, and the long, silent train waiting like a slumbering serpent. I found my assigned compartment easily enough. It was towards the rear of the train, the last one before the luggage car. Inside, the air was stale and carried a faint metallic tang. On the small table was a sealed wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox, wrapped in thick brown paper and tied with twine. It felt heavier than it looked when I picked it up. And then, I saw the writing on the window. More of it. Fainter, older, almost faded into the grime, but still discernible. Words scratched into the glass. Beware the conductor's smile. I shivered, despite the stuffy air. The conductor hadn't even checked my ticket yet. I hadn't seen anyone who looked like a conductor. The train had simply started moving, silently gliding out of the station as if propelled by unseen forces. Now, as the train rattles on through the darkness, the silence in the carriage is becoming unbearable. The stillness of the other passengers is deeply wrong. I want to believe they are just very heavy sleepers, but my gut screams otherwise. Every shadow seems to writhe. Every creak of the aging train sounds like a whispered warning. I keep glancing at the blood-red words on the window, then at the unmoving forms around me. What kind of train is this? What kind of delivery have I agreed to make? And what are these rules I'm already seeing fragments of, written in a language of fear and desperation? I have a sinking feeling that this journey is going to be far more than just a simple overnight trip. I have a terrible feeling that I've boarded something I can never truly get off of. The train continues its relentless journey, each passing minute stretching into an eternity. The darkness outside remains absolute, punctuated only by the occasional flicker of a distant light that vanishes as quickly as it appears. Inside the carriage, the stillness of the other passengers persists, a silent, unsettling accusation. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that they are simply exhausted travelers, dead to the world. But the way their heads loll, the unnatural pallor of their skin, it defies any normal explanation. I find myself avoiding looking directly at them, focusing instead on the wooden box on the table, the object of my ill-fated mission. It sits there inert, radiating a sense of cold dread. I resist the urge to touch it, to shake it, to try and discern its contents. The man in the hat's warning echoes in my mind. No peeking. But it's the other warnings, the ones etched in blood and grime, that truly have me on edge. The one about the moon, and the one about the conductor's smile. Neither makes any sense, yet they hang in the air like a suffocating premonition. Then I saw it. More writing. This time on the back of the seat in front of me, scratched so deeply into the worn fabric that it had left thin trails of something dark and crusty. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and deciphered the chilling words. Rule 1. Do not speak to the sleeping. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. It confirmed my growing suspicion that the other passengers weren't just sleeping. They were in some other state, a state I should not disturb. I ran my fingers gingerly over the rough etching, a wave of revulsion washing over me. Who wrote these rules? And why in God's name was I on a train where the instructions for survival were written in what appeared to be human blood? As if in answer to my silent question, more rules began to appear. They were everywhere, scrawled on the walls, etched into the metal window frames, even smeared across the dusty luggage racks. Each one a cryptic warning, each one adding another layer to the suffocating dread that had settled over me. I started to meticulously document them, pulling out my phone and taking photos, my hands shaking so badly that the images were often blurred. There were 7 in total that I could find, each one more disturbing than the last. Rule 1. Do not speak to the sleeping. The implication was clear and terrifying. They weren't to be woken, weren't to be engaged with in any way. Their stillness was not peaceful. It was a boundary I was not to cross. Rule 2. When the train stops, do not look outside for more than 60 seconds. This one sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. We had stopped briefly at a couple of unmanned platforms already, and I had glanced out, seeing nothing but darkness. What would happen if I looked for too long? What was out there in the pre-dawn gloom that I wasn't meant to see? Rule 3. If you hear knocking from the luggage car, ignore it. The luggage car was right behind my compartment. I hadn't heard anything yet, but the thought of unexplained knocking from a sealed compartment sent shivers down my spine. What could possibly be knocking? And why was I to ignore it? Rule 4. Do not use the restroom between the hours of 5 a.m. and 5:30 a.m. This one was oddly specific, and its specificity made it all the more unsettling. What happened during that 30-minute window? What horrors lurked behind the locked door of the train's restroom? I checked the time again, 4:58 a.m. The dreaded window was fast approaching. Rule 5. If a ticket inspector boards the train, do not show him your ticket. I hadn't seen any train staff since boarding. The train seemed to be operating autonomously. The thought of a spectral ticket, inspector appearing out of nowhere, and the dire consequences of showing him my valid ticket filled me with a primal fear. Rule 6. If you see a child, hide. This rule was perhaps the most disturbing. The image of a child on this silent, ghostly train sent a chill deeper than any of the others. What kind of child would be on a train like this? And why would I need to hide from it? Rule 7. If the writing on the windows changes, close your eyes and do not open them until the train stops. I glanced back at the blood-red warning about the moon. It hadn't changed yet, but the thought of it morphing into something else, something even more sinister, was almost unbearable. These were the rules. My survival on this bizarre and terrifying journey depended on following them. But as the minutes ticked by and the train plunged deeper into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that simply adhering to these morbid commandments might not be enough. There was something else at play here, something unseen, something ancient and malevolent that had dominion over this train and its silent passengers. I gripped the wooden box tighter, its coldness seeping into my hand. What was inside it? Was it the key to understanding this nightmare, or just another piece of the puzzle leading to my doom? The first rays of a weak, sickly dawn began to filter through the grimy windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the still figures in the carriage. 5 a.m. was approaching. Rule number 4 loomed large in my mind. The restroom door at the end of the carriage seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. I averted my gaze, trying to block out the growing sense of dread. This journey had just begun, and I had a terrible feeling that the worst was yet to come. The digital clock above the door flickered to 5 a.m. A wave of icy dread washed over me. Rule number 4. Do not use the restroom between 5 a.m. and 5:30 a.m. The restroom door at the end of the carriage, a simple metal portal, now seemed to radiate an aura of malevolent energy. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the image, trying to ignore the irrational urge to know what horrors awaited behind it. The silence in the carriage was thick enough to choke on, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks. Then, a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the luggage car behind my compartment. Knocking. Pause. Rule number 3. If you hear knocking from the luggage car, ignore it. My blood ran cold. The rules were being tested, one by one. The tapping continued, a slow, deliberate cadence that seemed to burrow into my skull. It wasn't frantic, not like someone was trapped and desperately trying to get out. It was patient, almost expectant, like something was aware that I could hear it, and it was simply waiting for me to acknowledge its presence. My gaze flickered towards the connecting door to the luggage car, a heavy steel barrier with a small, barred window. I fought the overwhelming urge to peek through it. What could possibly be in there that would produce such a disturbing sound? And why was I forbidden to acknowledge it? The tapping stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a heavy silence in its wake, a silence that felt even more menacing than the noise. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. So far, I had followed the rules, but the sheer strangeness of it all was starting to wear on my nerves. The unmoving passengers, the cryptic warnings, the unseen conductor, the knocking from the luggage car. It was all building to a crescendo of unbearable tension. The weak daylight filtering through the windows grew slightly stronger, revealing more details of the unsettling scene around me. The dust motes dancing in the faint light seemed to carry a sinister energy, and the shadows cast by the still figures in the seats appeared to writhe and shift on their own. I glanced nervously at the other passengers. Their stillness was unnerving. One elderly woman, her face pale and gaunt, had her head tilted at an impossible angle. A young man in the seat across the aisle had his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, but there was no life in them, no recognition. They were like vacant shells, preserved in some horrifying stasis. Just as I began to feel a sliver of hope that the dreaded 5:30 a.m. would soon pass and the restroom would lose its ominous aura, the train began to slow. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels decreased, replaced by a low, grinding sound as the brakes were applied. We were stopping. My eyes darted to the window. Rule number 2. When the train stops, do not look outside for more than 60 seconds. The train shuddered to a halt. Outside, the scene was shrouded in a thick, swirling fog. It was impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the window. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hiss of the train's brakes. A minute felt like an eternity. My gaze was drawn to the swirling mist, a sense of morbid curiosity battling with the ingrained fear of the rules. What was hidden in that fog? What would happen if I looked for too long? Just as the tension became almost unbearable, I saw something move in the mist. A fleeting shadow, a tall, indistinct figure that seemed to glide rather than walk. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the fog. My heart hammered in my chest. 60 seconds had to be almost up. I tore my gaze away from the window, focusing on the wooden box on the table. The train remained stationary, the silence stretching on. Had I looked for too long? Was that shadow a consequence? A sudden jolt ran through the train as it started moving again, the grinding of the brakes replaced by the familiar clatter of the wheels. I let out a shaky breath of relief. It seemed I had adhered to that rule, at least. But the image of that shadowy figure in the fog lingered in my mind, a chilling reminder of the unseen horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of this nightmarish journey. Then, I noticed it, the writing on the window next to me, the blood-red warning about the moon. It had changed. The words were still there, but now, beneath them, another sentence had appeared, scrawled in the same horrifying script. He is watching. Slow, tense tone, rule number 7. Close your eyes and do not open them until the train stops. My blood ran cold. The writing had changed. I had to close my eyes. Now, I squeezed my eyelids shut, plunging myself into absolute darkness. The sounds of the train seemed amplified in my absence of sight. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the faint hum of the carriage lights, and something else. A soft, rustling sound, like paper being crumpled, coming from somewhere close. I held my breath, every nerve ending screaming. Was it one of the sleeping passengers? Had I somehow broken rule number 1 without even realizing it? The rustling stopped. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. How long had it been? Was the train going to stop soon? The anticipation was agonizing. I fought the desperate urge to open my eyes, to see what horrors might be lurking just inches away. My imagination ran wild, conjuring grotesque images of the still passengers now stirring, their vacant eyes fixed on me. Suddenly, the train lurched violently, throwing me against the side of the compartment. There was a screech of metal on metal, followed by a deafening crash. The lights flickered and died, plunging me into absolute, terrifying darkness. The train was no longer moving. It had stopped. Was it safe to open my eyes? Had I waited long enough? The silence that followed the crash was absolute, a silence that screamed of unimaginable destruction. With trembling hands, I slowly peeled open my eyelids. The carriage was plunged in shadow, the only light filtering in from the outside, casting eerie silhouettes. The other passengers were still, their forms contorted at even more unnatural angles. And then I saw it. Standing in the aisle, bathed in the pale light from the window, was a figure, tall and gaunt, dressed in a dark uniform. A ticket inspector. Pause. Rule number 5 flashed through my mind. If a ticket inspector boards the train, do not show him your ticket. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel his gaze on me, cold and piercing. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his footsteps making no sound on the carriage floor. He stopped beside one of the still passengers, his long, skeletal finger pointing at something I couldn't see. Then he moved on, his silent inspection continuing. My heart hammered in my chest. What was I supposed to do? I had my ticket clutched tightly in my pocket. Every instinct screamed at me to offer it, to explain my presence on this nightmarish train. But the rule, the chilling warning, held me captive. The ticket inspector moved closer, his silent scrutiny sending shivers down my spine. He stopped, directly in front of my seat. I could feel his presence, a cold, suffocating weight. And then, slowly, he raised his head. Slow, tense tone. His face was long and cadaverous, his eyes hollow sockets that seemed to pierce right through me. And then he smiled, a wide, grotesque rictus that stretched his thin lips back to reveal rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. Pause. Rule number 6. If you see a child, hide. My blood ran cold, because standing behind the ticket inspector, barely visible in the shadows, was a small figure. A child. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural red light. The child's red eyes burned into me, and the ticket inspector's grotesque smile widened. Hide. The rule screamed in my mind. But where could I hide? The compartment was small, and the ticket inspector blocked the aisle. Panic clawed at my throat. The child took a step forward, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from its tiny chest. It wasn't a human sound. It was something ancient and feral. The ticket inspector remained silent, his hollow gaze fixed on me, his smile a mask of pure malice. I scrambled under the table, the rough wood scraping against my skin. It was a pathetic hiding place, offering little real protection, but it was all I could think of in that moment of sheer terror. The red glow of the child's eyes disappeared from my direct line of sight, but I could still sense its presence, a palpable wave of malevolent energy in the small space. The ticket inspector shifted, his silent movements sending shivers down my spine. I could hear his heavy breathing now, a rasping sound that seemed to fill the entire compartment. Then, a sound that made my blood run colder than ice. The rustling, the sound of paper being crumpled, coming from right above me, from the seat I had just vacated. Had one of the sleeping things awakened? I squeezed my eyes shut again, pressing myself as tightly as possible against the cold metal legs of the table. I could feel the vibrations as the ticket inspector moved around the compartment, his heavy footsteps now audible on the floor. He stopped near the window, and I heard a faint scratching sound. The writing. He was changing the writing again. My breath hitched in my throat. What new horror was being inscribed on the glass? Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The ticket inspector was gone. The only sound was the continued growling of the child, closer now, right beside the table. I risked a glance through the gaps in the wooden legs. The small figure was there, its red eyes burning like embers in the dim light. Its face was pale and gaunt, its features twisted into a grotesque parody of childhood innocence. It reached out a small, skeletal hand towards me, its fingernails long and sharp. I recoiled, a silent scream trapped in my chest. This was it. This was how it ended. Trapped on a ghost train with malevolent entities, about to become another silent passenger. Then, a flicker of movement outside the window. The fog had lifted, revealing a desolate landscape bathed in the sickly yellow light of the pre-dawn sky. And in the distance, I saw it. A small, dilapidated train station, its sign barely visible through the haze. Pause. Rahim Yarkhan. My destination. 3 stops. We had arrived. The growling of the child intensified, and its small hand reached further, its sharp nails scraping against my arm. But the train had stopped. Rule number 7. Close your eyes and do not open them until the train stops. I had followed the rule. Did that mean safety? The red glow of the child's eyes seemed to waver. Its growl softened, becoming a low, mournful whimper. The skeletal hand trembled, then slowly retracted. I kept my eyes tightly shut, my heart pounding in my ears. The silence in the compartment stretched on, broken only by my own ragged breathing. Was the ticket inspector still there? Was the child? I didn't dare to open my eyes. Then I heard it, the sound of the compartment door sliding open. A rush of cold, fresh air filled the small space. Footsteps, not the heavy, silent steps of the ticket inspector, but lighter, quicker steps, moving away from the compartment. And then a voice. Faint, distant, but clear. Is anyone there? The train, it's off the rails. I finally opened my eyes. The ticket inspector and the child were gone. The other passengers remained still, but the oppressive atmosphere in the carriage had lifted slightly. I cautiously crawled out from under the table. The compartment door was wide open. Outside, a young man in a railway uniform stood looking at the train, his face etched with confusion and concern. He hadn't seen anything. He didn't know what had happened. I grabbed the wooden box from the table, its weight feeling different now, less menacing. I had to get off this train. I had to deliver this package and get as far away from this nightmare as possible. As I stepped out of the damaged carriage onto the cold gravel beside the tracks, I glanced back at the window of my compartment. The blood-red writing was still there, the warning about the moon, and beneath it, the chilling addition, "He is watching." But one more line had appeared, scrawled hastily, almost desperately, as if added at the last possible second. It was barely legible, but I could make out the words. A final, horrifying rule I hadn't seen before. Slow, tense tone, never return to platform 7. The cold air hit me like a physical shock, clearing my head of the suffocating dread of the train. I stood on the gravel beside the tracks, the wooden box clutched tightly in my hands, its weight a strange comfort. In the distance, the young Man in the railway uniform was shouting into a handheld radio, his voice a frantic buzz. He was talking about a derailment, about how this section of track was supposed to be decommissioned years ago. He hadn't seen the ticket inspector. He hadn't seen the child. He just saw a wrecked train, somehow off the rails but still upright, looking as though it had been delicately placed there by a giant, malevolent hand that I walked away from him, towards the small, dilapidated station sign that read, Rahim Yar Khan. The name was a ghost in the morning light, a forgotten whisper on a dead track. My delivery was complete, but the man from the cafe, the man who had hired me, was nowhere to be seen. A second wave of panic washed over me. I had followed the rules, I had survived, but what now? The train was a tomb of silent passengers, and I was stranded at a derelict station with a box whose contents I still did not know. That I put the box down on a cold metal bench and sat beside it, my legs shaking. Too much to stand. The sun was rising now, a thin, weak orb in the sky that did little to warm the air. The eerie silence of the train was replaced by the silence of the desert, a vast, empty hush that was somehow just as menacing. The rules, the horrors, the silent passengers, they had all been confined to the space of the train. But what if they weren't? I thought back to the last rule I'd seen, the one scrawled on the window. Never return to Platform 7. It was a warning, a final, desperate plea, from the previous courier, who had obviously not survived. But it wasn't just about the platform. It was about the cycle. I realized, with a sickening jolt, that the package wasn't just a delivery. It was a way of passing on the curse, a ticket to the nightmare train. I was supposed to hand this box to the next poor soul who showed up at the station, a new driver of this haunted carriage. But there was no one. The young man with the radio was the only living person for miles. The train, a silent monument to its own horror, loomed behind me. I had to break the cycle. I had to destroy the package. I looked at the wooden box, its surface cool and smooth, sealed with twine. I fumbled for a knife in my pocket, my hands trembling. What was inside? I had to know. The man had said, no peeking, and I had survived by following the rules. But I was off the train now. The rules didn't apply anymore. With a deep breath, I sliced through the twine and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a simple cloth, was a small, ornate, antique music box. It was beautiful, a miniature work of art. But as I lifted it, the music box's lid opened. A thin, reedy tune began to play, a hauntingly familiar melody. It was the same sound I had heard on the train. The paper rustling. The music box. It was a lie. The sound I thought was paper was the sound of the music box playing its song, a lullaby for the sleeping, a summons for the damned. And as the tune played, I felt a new terror, a fresh dread that surpassed everything I had experienced on the train. The music wasn't just a sound, it was an invitation. I looked up. The sky, which had just moments ago been the sickly yellow of dawn, was now a deep, oppressive black. The air grew frigid again, and a thick fog began to roll in from the tracks, swallowing the light. In the distance, a low, guttural whistle cut through the air. The nightmare train was preparing to leave again. And as I stared into the box, into the small, beautiful, terrible object in my hands, I saw the final rule, etched into the wood of the music box itself. Once the melody begins, you must get on. The box wasn't the delivery. It was the ticket. I had broken the cycle, but by opening the box, I had started a new one, a more terrifying one. I was no longer a passenger. I was the conductor,